Okay, welcome everybody. This is chapter 4 from Gunstream, and in this chapter we're going to deal with the tissues of the body, their roles, where they might be found, and their makeup. So we're going to talk about epithelial tissue, describe its characteristics and types, and will indicate common locations and general functions for these tissues. We're going to describe the distinguishing characteristics of each type of connective tissue and indicate the common locations and general functions of these tissues. We'll describe the different types of muscle tissue, cardiac, smooth, and skeletal, and indicate their general function. And we'll describe the distinguishing characteristics and function of nerve tissue and indicate the common locations of nerve tissue. We'll talk about the composition of epithelial and connective tissue membranes in the body and give examples of each type. So what is a tissue? Well, a tissue is a group of cells with similar characteristics that do something as a team that a single cell could not perform on its own. And there's four basic types of tissues. Epithelial tissue, which forms coverings, produces secretions, and provides protection for areas of the body. We have connective tissue, which is the body's glue. It provides support and structure for the body. It connects other tissues to each other and also provides for transport and defense. Muscle tissue, which produces both internal and external movement. And nerve tissue, which is important in the sending and receiving of electrical signals that allow the human body to maintain a sense of balance that we call homeostasis. So epithelial tissue has 5 distinguishing characteristics. The cells are closely packed together. They're attached to connective tissue by a secretion called basement membrane. And the surface opposite the basement membrane is generally near a free surface. It could be the open chamber of an organ or a vessel, which we call the lumen, or it could be the external surface of the body, in which case we would be essentially a passageway to the external environment. Generally speaking, this tissue is avascular, meaning that it has a very limited or absent blood supply, and the tissues regenerate very rapidly, and this is primarily due to the fact that they experience a lot of physical damage, and so they have to be replaced as the cells become no longer viable once they sustain enough damage that they can't continue life processes. They function in a variety of ways in the human system. They vary with their location and their tissue type. The major roles are protection, absorption, filtration, and secretion. Glandular epithelia can be found inside glandular tissue. Now there's 2 major types of glandular tissue in the body. There's exocrine glandular tissue and endocrine glandular tissue. The difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland is that an exocrine gland contains a duct. A duct is basically the biological equivalent of a hose, and it provides a pathway for the cell to shoot secretions through and onto another surface or into the lumen of another organ or vessel. Okay, so basically with an exocrine gland, the cell produces a product, the cell secretes that product into the duct, and then the duct serves as a passageway to move that product to another location. An endocrine gland is different. An endocrine gland does not have a duct. The products that are generated by the cell are secreted directly through the plasma membrane and into the bloodstream. Examples of endocrine glands include things like the adrenal glands, the pituitary gland, and the thyroid gland. While examples of exocrine glands include glands like the sudiferous glands, those are your sweat glands, your sebaceous glands, which are your oil glands, and the mucus glands that line the respiratory and the digestive tract. Simple epithelium is a single layer of flat cube-like or column-like cells, and we find this in places in the body that are involved in diffusion, secretion, or filtration. You can see a picture of one type of epithelial tissue here. This is simple squamous epithelium. It's a single layer of thin flat cells that are held by the basement membrane to the underlying connective tissue. The junctions between the cells are very tight, and so generally, if substances are going to pass through this layer of tissue, they're going to have to go through the epithelial cell itself, and that can be facilitated by a variety of membrane proteins that provide for both active and passive transport. They aid in osmosis, diffusion, and filtration. Because they're not terribly thick, it's relatively easy, provided the membrane permits it, for substances to move through this very thin tissue layer from one place to another. They're found in the lungs, the kidneys, and the serous membranes of the ventral cavity. Remember that that's the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. Remember, the thoracic cavity contains the pericardial cavity around the heart, the pleural cavity around the lungs, and the mediastinum, which surrounds the larynx, the esophagus, the great vessels of the heart. So when they're found in these regions, they're called endothelium, so that just indicates their location. And you can see here what it looks like when you cut this type of tissue very thin and you stain it. You can see the simple squamous epithelial cells here. Underneath, of course, is the connective tissue, and this shows you an example of a location. You find this kind of tissue in the lungs because it aids in the movement of oxygen from the air you breathe into the blood, while the carbon dioxide in the blood moves into the lungs and is exhaled. It's important in the kidneys because it provides a way to filter the blood that comes into the kidney from vessels such as the abdominal aorta, and this allows us then to select molecules that are suspended in the blood plasma based on their size. The endothelial cells provide a type of filtration membrane that lets only molecules below a certain size pass through them. The result then is that we can remove waste products that are able to pass through the membrane because they're tiny enough. And we also end up having to take useful solutes, things like fuel and water and salts. And once we allow those to pass through the filtration membrane in the kidney, we have to put those back into the bloodstream. And there's a variety of transport mechanisms in the kidney that allow that to happen. So endothelial cells. Simple cuboidal epithelium are a single layer of box-like cells, and they aid in absorption and secretion. We find these in the secretory portions of the glands, the kidney tubules, and also in the surface of the ovaries. Again, you can see what they look like here in diagram. This black area here is the basement membrane, and of course the connective tissue surrounds it. And here's what it would look like in a stained tissue section. This would be the simple cuboidal epithelium. This would be the lumen that the cuboidal epithelium lines. Okay, so what you find in a lot of these cells are plasma proteins embedded in the membrane, plasma membrane proteins embedded in the membrane that allow for processes such as passive and active diffusion and passive and active transport of all types in order to select what substances we want to remain in the waste stream, in the urine, and what substances we want to put back into the blood, just as one example of the utility of this tissue type. Okay, simple columnar epithelium is a single layer of column-like cells. It aids in secretion and absorption. It can also possess goblet cells, cilia, and microvilli, and it's found in the uterus, the uterine tubes, and in the stomach and the intestine. So again, you can see the diagram up top. There's the row of simple columnar epithelial tissue. There's a row here. There's a lumen, and then there's a row down here. And you can see at the apical end tiny projections, and these are the villi. And what the villi do, again, is provide an increase in the surface area available for secretion and absorption. When you have to do a lot of that kind of work in a very small physical space, these modifications to surface area allow that to happen more effectively. You can also see that the nuclei sort of line up single file. That's one of the ways to distinguish simple columnar epithelia from epithelial tissue that is pseudostratified, as we'll see in just a minute. Another interesting aspect of this is that the movement of these microvilli allow absorption to take place more effectively. Okay. Pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium is a single layer of epithelial cells, some of which are shorter than the other, and this is one of the reasons why it looks initially as if the cells are stratified, as if there's many layers of cells as opposed to a single layer. And often at their apical surface they contain cilia. Cilia are projections from the cell membrane that utilize energy in the form of ATP to produce movement of substances across the apical surface. They possess goblet cells that produce mucus. The mucus is there primarily to trap particulates or lubricate substances that pass over the surface, and they line the upper respiratory passageways. Very important to understand that these cilia move the mucus in a direction towards the oral cavity. We call this the mucociliary escalator. The idea, again, behind the mucus in this part of the body is that it traps stuff that would harm the lung tissue if it were to get down there. Okay, so the pathogens become trapped, the particulates become trapped, and then the cilia are able to move all of that mucus towards the oral cavity, where you can either spit it out or you can swallow it. In any case, it doesn't end up in the lungs, where it would be extremely damaging. Stratified epithelial tissue is tougher stuff because there's more layers of cells. It can resist physical force more effectively. The innermost layer undergoes rapid cell division to replace the upper layers that are frequently shed as a result of interaction with physical force that produces trauma. Those cells are continuously lost. The primary function of this tissue type is protection. So you can see an example of stratified squamous epithelia here. They provide resistance to abrasion and to physical insult. The keratinized type forms the epidermis. That's the outer surface of your skin. For instance, if you touch your arm, okay, you're feeling stratified squamous epithelial tissue that's keratinized. It tends to be rather dry to the touch. The protein keratin is what provides this toughness, but also produces a membrane that's not terribly smooth. Okay, the non-keratinized type is found in areas such as the mouth, the esophagus, and the vagina. The purpose there again is for protection, but due to the lack of keratin, these surfaces are a lot smoother. They tend to be well moistened as a result of secretions that are produced nearby, such as vaginal secretions, saliva, and secretions that populate the esophagus, such as mucus. And this provides, again, ease of movement of substances across this surface so that it doesn't irritate, inflame, and scar. This is what it looks like in a diagram. You can see the layers of flattened cells here, and this is what it would look like here in actual stained tissue section. Important again to note that the deeper layers look a bit different than the upper layers. This is where the cell division actually takes place. These cells, as they divide, move towards the surface, and as they move towards the surface, they move away from a blood supply that provides nutrients and oxygen, and they will slowly begin to die and be shed. But as quickly as they're shed, they are replaced. Okay, so what we call these cells in this basal layer is an adult stem cell population. They have the potential to recreate a specific tissue in order for the tissue to continue to perform its function. If these basal cells didn't divide, the result would be loss of this stratified squamous epithelium in relatively short order. Transitional epithelium accommodates the stretching of the urinary bladder. When it's unstretched, the cells look almost cuboidal, but when it's distended, when it contains a lot of fluid, the cells look practically squamous. The purpose, again, for this is to provide the ability to adjust to different physical conditions inside the organ so that the tissue doesn't rupture and bleed and produce damage. So this transitional epithelium has the ability to stretch and snap back, and that's unique amongst all the other epithelial tissues. And thank goodness it can do that, right? Because we know that as the bladder fills, it stretches out, so we're able to hold some of our urine that's produced if we're not near an area where we can engage in urination. If we didn't have the ability for the bladder to stretch out and distend, we'd be in a bad way because we would feel urinary urgency practically all the time. So again, um, what an engineer would say is that this is an example of form following function. The reason that these cells have this characteristic is because they have a specific job to do, and those characteristics allow them to perform that job admirably. Now, connective tissue is the most abundant of all body tissues. It binds and supports other body tissues. We never find it on exposed surfaces, but it does have a unique ability to regenerate, similar to the ability of epithelial tissue to regenerate. But unlike epithelial tissue, which is made up of many tightly packed cells with very little space between them, what we see in connective tissue are scattered cells that are surrounded by what we call an extracellular matrix. Okay, this matrix is important because it's really the job description of the connective tissue. The matrix is what provides the tissue its function. It's often composed of water, of proteins, of sugars, and it also usually has an ample blood supply depending on the connective tissue type. And it's often populated by immune cells, which are our defense against disease. So there's two broad categories of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, where we have common tissues that bind other tissues and organs together. You could think of this like the body's spackling. And connective tissue with specialized functions. Okay? Connective tissue proper binds other tissues together. It's a basic supporting framework for organs, and the matrix consists of what we call ground substance, which is primarily composed of water and special molecules that are called proteoglycans. They're basically combinations of protein and sugar that are very good at holding water, and this provides now a lot of the strength of the connective tissue and a lot of the adhesive properties as well. The fibroblasts are the most abundant cells. They actually secrete the extracellular matrix, and we find proteins throughout the matrix that provide unique function. We have collagenous fibers that provide strength and a resistance to stretching and tearing, and elastic fibers that allow the connective tissue to stretch out and recoil when you apply physical force. And so here's what loose connective tissue looks like. You can see here that we have relatively few cells. You can see the cells peppered here, 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 and then you can see a lot of matrix, this sort of fluid stuff, and then embedded in the matrix you can see lots and lots of fibers. So this is the most abundant connective tissue in the body. It's named for its loose arrangement of protein fibers. It helps attach skin to muscle. It's a supporting framework for internal organs, nerves, and blood vessels. And it's also a site for immune reactions to take place. Basically, occasionally what will happen is that organisms or entities that produce disease can pass through the protective layer of the skin and can access the connective tissue underneath. The result of that is that we have to have a backup system in place to intercept those pathogens before they get a chance to get into the bloodstream and be spread throughout the body by the beating action of the heart. So what we have in the connective tissue are macrophages and granulocytes and lymphocytes that are waiting to encounter a pathogen. In the event that they do, the macrophages are important in engulfing and digesting the pathogen and breaking it into little pieces. Those pieces are then displayed by the macrophage on its cell membrane as a warning to the lymphocytes that there is a potential pathogen in the body, and if you see any cell or any unusual entity, a pathogen that displays that same molecule, you're going to have to go and kill it using a variety of chemical attacks. A lot of this is what happens in the connective tissue, so very important. Okay, our next connective tissue is adipose tissue. It has large numbers of adipocytes, those are fat cells, that store fat droplets. The major fat they store is triglycerides. Remember that those are molecules made up of 3 fatty acid tails connected to a glycerol backbone. It's found around internal organs and beneath the skin and provides padding and protection. It maintains our body temperature. And it's also important as a protective cushion and also as an energy storehouse. Most of our excess calories are stored as fat the body can utilize in between meals in the event that the fuel content in the blood drops below acceptable levels to keep cells alive. Fibrous connective tissue has an abundance of tightly packed collagenous fibers with relatively few cells scattered throughout, provides for strength and flexibility. It's a major component of ligaments, tendons, and also the dermis. Very important to understand with fibrous connective tissue that due to its poor blood supply, it heals relatively slowly. This is probably best reflected when you sprain an ankle or when you rupture a ligament. The healing time for a tendon, which is fibrous connective tissue with a moderate blood supply, is relatively slow, but it eventually does heal. Frequently, when you rupture a ligament, it has to be surgically repaired in order for it eventually to heal, or in some cases it has to be replaced. And that's because ligaments are fibrous connective tissue with virtually no blood supply. And you can see that when you look at living tissue, the color of tendons tends to be a light pink, which indicates a moderate amount of blood, while ligaments tend to be almost jet white, meaning that there's an absence of blood vessels. So we say that to a large extent, the material that makes up ligaments and tendons is avascular, meaning it lacks an adequate blood supply. Elastic connective tissue has abundance of elastic fibers. They're found where we need the ability to stretch and snap back, such as in the lungs, in the air passages, and in the walls of the arteries. Cartilage is an interesting connective tissue. It's a semi-solid connective tissue that contains chondrocytes, cartilage cells, living inside chambers of this material that they actually secrete while they maintain it, but they can't go anywhere once they've essentially embedded themselves in their own matrix. So the way that they get nutrition is through diffusion of oxygen and nutrients through this matrix to the chondrocyte to keep it alive. Major functions include support and protection. There's 3 major types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. And so let's take a look at hyaline cartilage. It's the most abundant. It's the protective covering that we see over bones at joints, things like the knee, the ankle, the elbow, the wrist. The bones that are involved in those joints are all covered at their ends with cartilage, which provides padding and protection, and also keeps the bones that are involved in that articulation from rubbing against each other and fragmenting and producing a condition that we know as arthritis, where bits of bone fragment actually start to rattle around inside the joint cavity and produce a very painful condition. It also forms parts of the nose, supports the walls of air passages, and it forms the abundance of the embryonic skeleton. Prior to our adult musculoskeletal system forming, we actually begin with a cartilage model, which is then eventually slowly replaced by ossified bone. We'll see bone in a bit here. So we actually start out with a skeleton made of a more primitive material than we end up with. In fact, this is an interesting phenomenon in human development. It's an example of what biologists like to call ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. Basically, that the events that happen during the process of human development seem to mimic the events that took place over evolutionary time on this planet. If we look at the evolution of the skeletal system, some of the earliest skeletal systems were made entirely out of cartilage, and subsequent to that, we began to see forms of life that had a bony skeleton. Examples are still abundant today of organisms with cartilaginous skeleton, things like sharks and rays. And the first organism that we know of that had a bony skeleton would have been the bony fishes. So the thinking is that the memory of evolution is actually stored in our DNA, and every time we generate a new organism, we sort of replay the events that led up to the life forms that are present on this planet as we know it in some form. Elastic cartilage has an abundance of elastic fibers that provide stretchability and resiliency. We find this in the larynx and in the external ear. You can, for instance, grab your ear and pull on it and it'll snap back into place. The larynx is the same way. The epiglottis is an example of a structure in the larynx that closes when we swallow so we don't get air and food, or we don't get food and water down into the lungs, and it is made of elastic cartilage. It has the ability, again, to stretch and snap back. You can see the elastic fibers here in the diagram, in the picture above and also in the stained section below. You can see them radiating throughout the matrix. The major protein there is something called elastin. Fibrocartilage has an abundance of tightly packed collagenous fibers. It's designed to resist compression and tension. It forms the outer segment of the intervertebral disc, which we call the annulus, and it also provides the cushioning for a joint known as the pubic symphysis, among other places that it's also found in the body. It's a little bit tougher stuff than hyaline cartilage. One of the things you might be familiar with is the phenomenon known as a slipped disc. Okay, what happens when people have a slipped disc is that the cartilage between the vertebrae, as a result of physical force, can be pushed out from between the vertebrae and can bulge into the vertebral canal and produce pressure on the spinal cord. And this can produce now numbness and tingling in areas distant from the injury. And we call these radiculopathies. This is due to the fact that in young adults and sometimes even in teenagers, that liquid nucleus inside the intervertebral disc, which is contained inside the fibrocartilage, can be forced through the annulus and produce this condition. As we age, one of the interesting outcomes of getting older is that the fibrocartilage in our intervertebral disc becomes more extensive, and as a result, we're less likely to experience a slipped disc. Examples of activities that produce slipped disc would be things like lifting up heavy objects in an improper fashion by bending at the waist and straining, and that can push these discs out of place, among other types of traumatic injuries to the vertebral column and to the spine. Okay, bone is another type of connective tissue. We call this osseous tissue. The prefix ossi or osteo should remind you of bone. It's the hardest and most rigid of the connective tissue because it has calcium salts in its matrix along with collagen fibers that serve to make bone tough in two different ways. The collagen fibers provide resistance to shear force, while the calcium salts provide resistance to compression. So this gives rigidity and strength to support the body. The matrix is deposited in concentric lamellae. You can see examples of the lamellae here around a central canal known as a Haversian canal. The osteocytes are located between the lamellae and live in little chambers called lacunae and are connected with other osteocytes by tiny canals called canaliculi. And the reason for this is so that we can get nutrients to all the bone cells and remove waste products from all the bone cells without having to have them move from their location. They're trapped inside the bone. They can't go anywhere. And so these connections between adjacent cells provide a type of bucket brigade that allows us to get the cells the nutrients and the oxygen they need while also at the same time removing the waste products. This is a similar structural strategy to what we see when you pour the foundation for a building or pour a sidewalk. We don't begin immediately by just pouring the concrete into a hole. We usually generate a frame that's made up of steel or in some cases iron, and then we pour the concrete around that frame. The steel and the iron provides resistance to shear force, while the concrete provides resistance to compression. And so bone is the same way. If you want to do an interesting experiment to reveal the proteinaceous component of bone, the next time you get a bucket of chicken, save the wishbone and dip it in vinegar for about 3 days. And when you remove that wishbone from the vinegar, all that will be left is the protein component. The calcium salts will have dissolved, and that wishbone will now be stretchy and bendy, just as if it were a rubber band. So that's something fun that you can do in your spare time. Blood is a liquid connective tissue, one of two, the other one being lymph. It consists of numerous cells suspended in a liquid matrix. The 3 cells are the red blood cells, known as the erythrocytes, the white blood cells, known as the leukocytes, and the platelets, which we call the thrombocytes. They're important in transporting material throughout the body. The erythrocytes transport oxygen and, to a lesser extent, carbon dioxide between tissues. The leukocytes provide defense against disease using chemical or physical attacks on pathogens, which are organisms or toxins that tend to produce a disease state in the body. And the platelets are important in blood clotting. Okay, so you can see examples of each indicated in the diagram and also in the stained blood smear. Okay, muscle tissue comes in 3 distinct flavors. These cells are unable to divide, so they can't regenerate if they're damaged, but they can grow larger as a result of use, and we call that hypertrophy. The way they grow longer and larger is through the acquisition of more muscle protein. The number of cells stays the same. The cells are called muscle fibers because they're long and thin. They use specialized protein for contraction. The major proteins, as we're going to learn later on, are myosin and actin. The contraction moves the body and it produces heat. Here's an example of what skeletal muscle looks like. It's attached to bone and it moves the body. It's under voluntary control, so we tell it what to do consciously. The cells are elongated, cylindrical arrangements with many nuclei and many striations. So when skeletal muscle cells first form, what happens is that individual cells that will eventually be skeletal muscle merge together. They fuse and lose their intervening cell membranes, and then they form this long, cylindrical, multinucleate conglomeration of cells that produces massive amounts of muscle protein, actin, myosin, tropomyosin, and so forth. It's this cylindrical arrangement of the cells and of the proteins that they secrete that provides the ability for the muscle to contract, because what happens with this longitudinal arrangement of muscle fibers is that when the muscle shortens, when the muscle contracts, the fibers actually slide across each other's surface using ATP as an energy source in order to produce this massive amount of force. So this is one of the few cells in the body that's what we call a syncytia, or a multinucleate cell. A single cell membrane and a single cytoplasm contain multiple nuclei. You'll also find lots of mitochondria in skeletal muscle tissue because they need a lot of power in order to produce movement. And you'll also see an extensive endoplasmic reticulum running throughout muscle tissue. That's important as an internal trigger that begins muscle contraction. And you'll find the other organelles scattered throughout the cytoplasm as well. So this is a little bit of an unusual cell. Okay, cardiac muscle tissue is similar to skeletal muscle tissue, except that it's only found in the heart. It is not under conscious control. It is an involuntary muscle. Its contraction is a matter of an intrinsic cell property called autorhythmicity. It has the ability to produce rhythmic contractions all on its own as long as it has oxygen and fuel. But the coordination of those contractions results from the cell-cell junctions that you can see in the diagram, which we call intercalated discs. They contain structural junctions for the heart muscle cells as well as tunnels between the heart muscle cells, which we call gap junctions. The tunnels allow electrical information to be sent from one cell to the other that coordinates muscle contraction in the heart so that each heart muscle cell isn't beating to its own rhythm. And the tight junctions, the desmosomes, allow the heart muscle cells to stay attached to each other so they don't come apart when the heart beats. So these intercalated discs are a very important cellular feature. They possess a single nucleus per cell, but they also have striations, just as the skeletal muscle had striations. The striations represent the overlap of muscle protein, which increases as the muscle contracts and decreases as the muscle relaxes. Okay, so remember that these muscle filaments, these protein filaments, slide over the tops of each other using ATP for fuel. Smooth muscle looks quite a bit different from cardiac or skeletal muscle. The cells are spindle-shaped, they're thick in the middle and tapered on the ends. We find these in the walls of blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and hollow organs. They're under involuntary control. We don't consciously tell them what to do. Their job primarily is to promote internal movement. The cells have a single nucleus. They don't have striations, but they do possess actin and myosin. It's just arranged in a very different way than in skeletal or in cardiac muscle. So when we talk about these last two types of muscle tissue, cardiac and smooth, these are involuntary muscle tissue types. The heart muscle tissue has autorhythmicity, which is modulated by a division of the nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, which is that division of the nervous system that works without our conscious control. And this is what regulates the speed and the rate of contraction in cardiac tissue and also in smooth muscle tissue. Okay, so this all happens without us having to think about it. Now, nerve tissue is specialized for sending and receiving electrical information. It's found in the brain, the spinal cord, and in the peripheral nerves. There's two main types of cells, the neurons, which actually send and receive the electrical information, and the neuroglia, which provide support, protection, and nourishment for the nerve cells. You could think of them as the personal assistants to the nerve cells. Without the neuroglia, the nerve cells would die in a relatively short period of time. The neurons are the functional unit of the nerve tissue. They have a cell body and one or more neuron processes, and they respond to environmental changes by making neural impulses. They send electrical signals by changing the distribution of ions on either side of the nerve cell membrane, and that change in distribution of ions results in a change of charge, and that change in charge moves in a particular direction from generally the nerve cell body, which you can see here, to a process known as the axon, where it will eventually terminate at the end of the axon. What will happen next is that a chemical signal will be produced that essentially is the release of a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter will then float across a tiny physical gap between the nerve cell we're looking at and the next nerve cell in the pathway, and that chemical will then attach to the membrane of the next nerve cell and induce a similar electrical change that will then be passed from the next nerve cell down the pathway to the end of its axon, and then the entire process will repeat. So they send and receive electrical information. They also transform physical information into electrical information. For instance, photoreceptors in the eye are able to transform light and color into electrical information that the brain interprets as sight. There are receptors in the tongue that are able to transform molecules in the food that you eat into electrical information that we interpret as flavor or taste. There are neurons in the nasal cavity that attach to components in the air that you breathe, and we turn that information into what we interpret as odor. Okay, the brain only understands electrical information, and so it's very important that these specialized nerve cells are able to take the physical information and turn it into something that our brain can recognize and work with. Okay, body membranes are thin sheets of tissue that line the cavities of the body, cover surfaces, or they separate tissues and organs. And there's two main types of body membranes: epithelial membranes and connective tissue membranes. Epithelial membranes are made up of epithelial tissue that covers loose connective tissue. Examples include serous membranes that line the ventral body cavity and cover internal organs, and they secrete a lubricating fluid that reduces friction and promotes internal movement. Examples include the pleural membrane, the pericardial membrane, and the peritoneum, which you find in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Mucous membranes line tubes and cavities open to the exterior, such as in the respiratory and digestive system. And they have goblet cells that generate mucus, which keeps the cells moist and lubricate, and it also traps particulates and pathogens so that they don't produce damage to cells and tissues that aren't designed to withstand it, specifically, for instance, in the respiratory system. Examples include the mucous membranes of the digestive and the respiratory tract. Cutaneous membranes include the skin. The skin is a layer of epithelial tissue, stratified keratinized squamous epithelia, overlying the dermis, which is connective tissue, and then underneath that you've got subcutaneous fat, and then below that a layer of connective tissue, and then connection directly to muscle. Okay, so cutaneous membrane, another example of an organ, right? An organ is a collection of tissues that can do something together as a team that a single tissue couldn't do on its own. Connective tissue membranes are formed only of connective tissue. Examples include the meninges, which line and protect the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. The perichondrium, which lines and protects cartilage and bone, provides nourishment for the growing cartilage and removes waste products. The periosteum, which provides nourishment and waste removal services for bone. And synovial membrane, which produces a lubricating fluid called synovial fluid that eases the movement of joints that allow us to move from place to place. Those are special kinds of joints. We call those joints diarthrotic joints because they have the greatest range of motion of any structure, or any functional classification of joint. Okay, that brings us to the end of Chapter 4. Again, review this material as it will pop up online in the form of quiz questions, midterm questions, and final exam. And I'll see everybody in the next podcast. Thank you.